we have made it to the final chapter of the autobiography of Elizabeth Mills Oakton Whitaker. This is the final chapter, and it's really just full of random bits and pieces about her life, but it is quite long. So lots of interesting things we're going to read about in this final part of her life. You'll notice that she will revisit some of the stories she's already shared in the book. And what's interesting is she tells these stories differently. So I'm not sure which version is the more accurate one. So she was in her late 90s when she was interviewed. So I'm guessing it might have been difficult to recall all of the details of these stories. I really enjoyed doing this, you guys. I can't believe it's almost been a year since I started this book. For those of you who donated for William's grave, I will be reaching out to you in the next few days to let you know the date, the time, the details, if you want to be a part of that. And if you're not able to attend, no worries, because it will be included in the documentary. So stay tuned for that. After we finish this chapter, the next video to come out will be the documentary. So I'm excited. I might put out some other things in between unrelated to my book readings. So stay tuned. And after we're finished with this book, I'm going to take a little break, and then we're going to start the next book, which, based on the feedback that I got last time, I think is going to be my autobiography. So should be interesting, should be kind of fun. Stay tuned for more details about that. Okay, let's go ahead and get started, you guys. Chapter 30. This chapter consists of bits and pieces of Grandma's life, notes found later. All that follows is told in her own words. The first Relief Society organization in Centerville took place shortly after I came to live in Centerville as T.W.'s wife. I was set apart as a visiting teacher by Nathan Porter, and Mary Smith was my partner. They called them block teachers then. Mary was the best friend I ever had. We loved each other like sisters, and never a cross word between us. She had a party soon after we met at church that first Sunday at her home. Then I gave one and invited all back that were at Mary's party. We became lifelong pals. We made and bought dresses alike, with bonnets to match. Each seemed to enrich the life of the other. T.W. planted me a lovely orchard. He had the very first nursery here in Centerville. Peaches, plums, apples, pears, mulberry trees for the silkworms, all kinds of trees, and tended them, kept them pruned, and they thrived. Mary and I peeled and dried peaches and apricots, mostly peaches, and took them to John Adams, the old gentleman, not his son, John Q., who lived a long time later. Brother Adams had a store, and he paid us 8 cents a pound for them when the fruit was very good, and a little more if perfect. He sold them to miners. When we had more that he could use, he gave us an order for ZCMI, and we took it and could buy whatever we wanted. But before we had an orchard, I peeled and dried peaches on shares for O.M. Duell, who did have lots of peach trees and plums. Our own orchard bore 2 years later. T.W. built me a carpet loom, and I wove carpets for extra money. It was while we still lived up in the lot that he married Hannah. She lived right in with us for the first 6 months. Annie did most of the housework, and Hannah kept mostly to her room, coming out only for meals and then going back into her room. I never asked her to help with any of the work. Before I had a loom, I went up to Grandma Brown's and wove on her loom. Mine wasn't finished until after we moved into the big house. It was she who taught me how to weave carpets, wool, and cotton. Then later, I did the fine weaving on the tiny wire loom T.W. made for me. That was after we raised the silkworms and had silk to weave. I had a beautiful spinning wheel for the purpose of spinning the silk into thread to be woven. He made that too. When he sent to England for the silkworm eggs, they came across the ocean and clear across the plains. They were carefully wrapped up in writing paper, and put in a heavy envelope and mailed. The latter part of their journey was by Pony Express. His own father prepared and sent them. He, T.W., said that when he was a boy, he used to grow them just for amusement. He wondered if they would live and survive here. But they did, and we hatched and raised them for over 6 years. We fed them on mulberry leaves, and I made the silk thread and wove it into material. Also knit silk socks from the thread for T.W., and knitted him a vest of silk and a tie. When Brigham Young learned of this, he asked for a tie and vest, and I made one and socks for him. We always saved a few of the nicest cocoons for eggs. They were a good finger length when mature. The others were dropped into a large kettle of boiling water to kill them before they chewed their way out of the cocoons, which of course would cut all the silk strands, so they would be just tiny short pieces and couldn't be wound off. If I could weave them up at once, I would place 18 cocoons in each bowl of water. It took that many to make one thread strong enough to weave or knit. I wish you could have seen the neat little room T.W. made for me to weave the silk on after he saw that I could really make the fabric. You see, I wove the first piece on Grandma Brown's carpet loom, not then having a loom of my own. Someone told Brigham Young that I'd raised and made silk from the worms. And he sent out to Centerville to see if it were true, and said he wanted to see it for himself. That's how I came to make him an outfit, exactly like the one I made for T.W. The only good picture we have of T.W. is the one I gave you, Nora, and he is wearing the silk vest, tie, or cravat, and the socks. Of course, the socks don't show. It's a bust picture. Yes, I answered. I'm using it in the pictorial family group sheets I have made showing him as the husband and you as the wife. It's a very good picture, I think. Don't you think your son John looks quite a lot like him? Some, perhaps, but your grandfather was taller. Still, Johnny is more like him in most ways, including looks, than any of the others. But to get back to the silk that I wove. First of all, it was about 1.5 yards long and about 1 foot wide. I put fringe on it and embroidered a rose in each corner. Brigham so admired it that I gave it to him. He used it as a neck scarf. The embroidery work was in a pretty ripe strawberry color. He took it with him many places, using it as a scarf or neck piece, and showing it off up to Cache Valley, Salt Lake, and St. George, and said, God bless the efforts of such wonderful and industrious people, and I was later informed after he died that it was placed in the Mormon Pioneer Museum. But first, when they put it there, somehow they gave the credit for the first silk being made to Emmeline B. Wells. Later, however, it was straightened out, and they got T.W.'s enlarged picture to hang by it, and will have mine also after I'm gone. I, Nora B. Miles, found all of this to be true as I visited the Utah Daughters of Pioneer building years later and found the silk room, which is in the farthermost corner of the 3rd floor, northeast corner. There are 2 pictures, one of Grandma and the other of Grandpa, life-sized bust pictures hanging on opposite walls, facing each other in the tiny silk room. Displayed there are also skeletons of silkworms and a glass bottle of the silkworm cocoons, and much more silk in panels on the wall. Brigham sent back east for 1,600 brass reed loom. 2 threads went through each reed. It was on that loom that I wove the silk to make Brigham's vest. But the color wasn't exactly the same, so I wasn't exactly pleased with it. But I gave it to him anyway, and he wore it on special occasions. I made all my own silk thread and sewed with it, made buttonholes and sewed on buttons and the like. I even made enough to knit myself 2 pairs of silk stockings on very fine needles, and I tell you, they wore well. We gave many of the eggs away, and dozens of people tried to make silk, but it was too much trouble, and no one made a success of it. Then, when he brought Hannah home as his wife, he asked that I let her have the big front room. That was where the silkworms were, and where I had parties with my closest friends. but I did as he asked. I moved into the little bedroom and the shanty kitchen. This left the care of the silkworms entirely up to Hannah. She simply did not care for them properly, and they gradually died. Well, I had a few parties anyway. One time, it was while Hannah was in bed with her first baby, Lizzie. I had Millie marry Grandma Brown and Eliza Porter over. We had a fine time, laughing and talking all afternoon. That was the night I think I told you of before, about when T.W. came home. Hannah told him we had been making fun of her and laughing at her the full time. I told you what happened. When he demanded an explanation from me, I marched him back into her room and confronted her, making her admit she hadn't really heard a word we said, that she'd made the whole thing up. She cried and said it was because she was so lonely, but I was so angry that I laid the law down to him. After I had gone and got every one of those women, who all swore to him that Hannah's name had never ever been mentioned, nor thought of the whole time. So then, when he went to Hannah and said, "Why did you lie to me?" she confessed and cried and said, "She thinks she's so smart and holds her head so high. I wanted to humble her. But I'm sorry, I'll go and ask for her forgiveness." But I didn't want to speak to her or even look at her, and told him so. And then I added, "T.W., I never want it said that I drove her out of my house. But you mark my word, when her baby is 6 weeks old, you get her another place to live. If you don't, I'll take my children and go and get me a place to myself, and she can stay here. I won't live in the same house with her any longer." And I never mentioned it again. But he knew I meant it, and you bet, when the 6 weeks were up, he got her a place east of my house, and she went there to live. Yes, it's true. I was really happy with T.W. for 12 years. Then he felt it his duty, as I've said, and found him another woman as Brigham asked, and everything in our lives, mine especially, changed. Never again did I feel the same spontaneous surge of love for him as came to me before this happened. I remember when the Salt Lake Temple was finished and decorated. They opened it and let everybody, outsiders and all, who wanted to go through it and see it for 1 whole week before they dedicated it. Oh, it was the most beautiful building west of the Mississippi. Then there was the Salt Lake Tabernacle. What a grand building that was. And the Salt Lake Theater building on State Street and First South. I remember when Henry Ward Beecher came to Salt Lake, and T.W. took me to hear him preach, and he was wonderful. We paid $1 a ticket. He talked in the tabernacle. I never forgot how I enjoyed that lecture. Then there was Madame Patty, the great prima donna singer, lyric soprano. She went through Salt Lake and stayed overnight on her way to Los Angeles to sing. They asked her to sing in the Salt Lake Theater, but when she saw it, she said it was too small for a voice like hers and refused. Then she saw the tabernacle and said if they'd fix it some, she really wanted to sing there. She loved that building. She promised that on her way back east, she'd sing there. But first, they must wire it with electric lights. They did, and she sang there, and I went and paid $5 for 1 seat. It was another marvelous experience for me, a real treat of a lifetime, and I never forgot it. We had our fun at home, too, we wives, as I've told you. It was Grandmother Brown who subscribed to the New York Ledger. It came once a week on the Pony Express, run by Wells Fargo. We all lived within calling distance of each other. Grandma Brown would read to us, while we younger women with families would mend, knit, or sew as we listened. The first story she read was by Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was a sister to Henry Ward Beecher. The title of that story, a book actually that was printed in serial form each week in the Ledger, was Ismael or Out of the Depths. We all looked forward to that so much. Then later, there was Uncle Tom's Cabin by the same author. We are told that that book did a great deal toward turning the sentiment of the public toward freeing the slaves. When my son, Sam, was 8 months old, my Uncle William Mills was called on a mission to England. He sent to Centerville and asked me to come to Salt Lake and help him to get ready to go. So I left Will in charge of Annie and T.W. and took my baby Sam and went to Salt Lake to help him. I made fruit cakes, baked bread, mended and pressed clothes, all that sort of thing. It took us a week to get everything prepared. Then I missed the man with his wagon who had promised to bring me back, so I began to walk home. I started at 1 o'clock in the afternoon and carried my baby all the way, sitting down on the side of the road when I had to rest. If I saw a team coming, I would climb away up the foothill and hide till it passed, for fear of being embarrassed by being asked if I wanted a ride. So I walked all the way home from Salt Lake to Centerville. It was 10 o'clock at night when I got there, nearly dead with weariness. When I came into the house, T.W. said, "I was going to hitch up in the morning and come to Salt Lake to inquire if you wanted me to deliver your clothes and things. I thought you'd gone for good." That made me so mad that I just sat down and cried. Not many times in my life have I wept, but I did then. I remember 4 or 5 times of walking home from Salt Lake. Once when I went with Nathan Porter. He told me to meet him at sundown at a certain place. I went there and waited till dark, and he didn't show up, so I walked home. I got off on the wrong road that takes off down into Bountiful. It was dark, and I walked over a mile and crossed a deep stream that was directly in my way to get back onto the right road. When I got through that water and up from the bank, whom should I see but Nathan Porter just on his way home. He took me to Centerville, to Porter Lane, where he turned off to go home and let me off there, and I had to walk the rest of the way to my place. That, I believe, was the last time I walked home from Salt Lake. But anyway, T.W. was good to me. He loved to get me things he knew that I wanted. Once, when we were in the ZCMI, I saw a lovely piece of printed voile with blue flowers on it. I wanted it so bad, but it was $3 a yard, so I wouldn't buy it. I got me a pretty piece of pink and white that was much cheaper instead. Well, T.W. said nothing, but he went back and bought me enough of the blue-flowered material for a dress and gave it to me for my birthday. I was delighted, and that dress wore well, too, and I saved enough to make my baby Emmy a dress. One time I went to Salt Lake, and, as usual, I had a large list of things to get for my neighbors. One woman gave me a $10 bill, and I was to get her some things, including 1 pound of indigo dye. I rode with someone in a wagon till we got to where the streetcar was, got in and sat down inside and emptied my purse into my lap and was sorting out my lists and papers, throwing away things of no value. I picked up this dirty, crumpled bill and carelessly tossed it out the window. I didn't do one bit of shopping for myself that day. It took every cent I had to make up that money that I had thrown away. When your babies are little, they make your arms ache, but when they are grown up, they make your heart ache. It isn't true that what the eye doesn't see, the heart doesn't grieve, because your imagination can paint pictures that go farther than just seeing. For instance, you may know your husband is not at home, and perhaps he is away, making love to another woman. Your heart would surely grieve over what your imagination painted in your thoughts, though the eye didn't actually see it. Will was 3 years and 3 months older than Sam, and it always seemed to me that Father favored Will. When they got big enough to help a little, he would buy a pair of boots for Will and just a pair of shoes for Sam. And when I said, "If you can't buy 2 pairs of boots, why don't you just buy 2 pairs of shoes? Will is older and does the chores in the wet weather, and Sam is too little to go out in the wet." Grandmother Brown, the first time I saw her, she looked to me like a little old woman in her 80s. And she never changed. She looked just the same years later when she died. Hers was a hard, sad life, but she made the best of it. She had a family of girls, 7 I think, and 1 boy. He married Millie's Maggie. He was dreadfully spoiled. I was a girl with her girls. She nursed me with John, Susie, Mamie, Joe, Josephine, Evie, and Walty. I did everything I could for myself, and she said, "You don't really need a nurse. You are the most independent woman I ever saw." She charged $5 and came 9 mornings. Her husband left her and went back east, She raised her family alone. Her only son, Tim, was, as I mentioned, a terribly spoiled boy. His mother thought he could do no wrong. He married Maggie Smith, and they went up north to live. She had 2 boys and 3 girls. When her oldest boy, little Tim, was 18 years old, he and his father went after wood. Both got drunk and had a terrible quarrel, and then the son killed his father with an axe. A telephone message was sent to Centerville, and I had to break the news to poor Millie. When I told my son, Will, what had happened, he nearly fainted. It was a shock to him. He couldn't eat his dinner or return to work. I went to Millie and stayed all day with her. I told her only that I had bad news and that Tim had been killed. Then, just as I feared, her 2 sisters, Maggie Brandon and Becky Porter, came and would have told her all, but I went outside and met them and sent them away. I told them she was completely used up and had all she could stand for one day, to let her have one night's sleep before she was told any more. I just ached for her, but trouble never killed anybody. If it did, there'd be few of us left. We had the first nursery in Centerville, even before the Smiths or Porter Waltons. We raised and sold plants and flowers, China asters, chrysanthemums, and the like. He grafted trees and budded trees and rose bushes. He didn't have a greenhouse, but he fixed a hotbed outside and put canvas over the plants when it was cold to protect them from the frost. It worked just fine. My husband made himself a little homemade lathe, a little instrument to use in his fine carpentry work. He made me a most beautiful bedstead and chairs to match, with carved roses on it. Carved with the lathe. He made lots of beautiful furniture and things like patio marchers, rolling pins, light stands, tables, all kinds of chairs, anything he could sell, even lovely rockers. All the wood furniture we had in our home was made by him and the boys when they got big enough to learn. He taught them, and they became very good at it. But he sold everything so cheap that he didn't make much money. He took contracts and built churches, hotels, and bridges, as well as some of the finest homes. He took Sam and Will with him as his assistants. Susan Seaman was another dear friend of both Mary and me, and we had parties, all of us who didn't consider ourselves too religious. We always had a good time. Usually I took a little sugar and some tea. We broke the word of wisdom and had our cup of tea. I couldn't stand molasses in my tea, but that's what most of the folks used then, as sugar was too expensive. Oh, I believe that was the happiest time of my life. Those first 12 years in Centerville. At these parties, we always had our dinner first. A lovely cooked meal. If any one member, such as Grandma Brown, a widow, and very poor, the rest of us furnished the meal for her. My men folks worked away from home a lot, so we had quite a few meetings at my house. I had a little money I earned for myself, so I furnished the sugar and tea whenever possible. I just couldn't stand molasses as a sweetener, especially in my drink. Yes, we had good times, all right. When I first came to Centerville, most women wore faded sunbonnets and big plaid shawls. But when I came here, I had a lovely mantilla and a black dress and coat that I'd made myself from money I'd earned. They called me proud. I didn't feel proud. I just wanted to look nice. I always washed and cleaned myself up soon as I got up every morning. My father taught me that. To look my best at all times, and I'd feel better inside and that morning. Early was the time to do it. It was second nature to me. But after T.W. married a second wife, I learned the difference in a hurry. He simply had not the money to get me the nice little things as he used to, though he was ever most kind and considerate and did all that he could. My son Will served as a deputy sheriff here for a long time. When Lagoon was opened for the first time, Will was there as sheriff in his new uniform with a big star on his lapel showing that he was the law. They had hired John Philip Sousa to furnish the music with his band. They happened to be passing through Salt Lake to California and were hired to play in the Salt Lake Theater. I think tickets sold at $2 each, if I remember. At Lagoon that opening night, one of the members of Sousa's band got mixed up with a married woman, and her husband shot the man and killed him. No one actually saw the shooting. It was at night, but they locked the man up, and Will was then disguised as a prisoner and placed in the cell with the murderer to try to get him to talk and reveal what he'd done. This he did. The man was arrested and was finally released, as he had some cause for what he did. I remember when Millie's children were little. She lived up on the range in Weber County, where many of our Centerville men had big ranches. They were homesteading. Her children took ill with black diphtheria. One died, so she brought her other children to Centerville for proper care. But her mother, old Sister Cherry, would not let her in the house for fear of the disease. But B.H. Robert's wife, Sarah Louisa, Millie's husband's oldest child, let her use a room in her big house and was good to her. The first money I ever received for nursing in Centerville was paid me by a Mr. Peterson, a railroad man in Ogden. I nursed his wife, who died of childbed fever. I sat up night and day for 3 nights and days, but she died. The baby boy lived. He paid me 3 $5 gold pieces. Usually I nursed for $1 a day and did all the housework. I loved nursing confinement cases best. But all in all, nursing was what I liked doing best. I nursed all my own daughters with their babies and all my sons' wives with theirs. There was a time when all the men who had more than one wife went on the underground, taking refuge from their tormentors, outsiders, and apostates, who hunted them down and beat them and sometimes tarred and feathered them. We had to watch out all the time when our men were at home. If we caught sight of any strangers, we told the husband, and he hid or dashed up to the Streeper home, where they had a secret apartment in their lovely big house. Before I had my own loom, when my children were little, and we needed blankets, clothing, and other things, I went to Ogden and got 100 pounds of wool and spun it into yarn or shares. Every 3rd pound I spun was mine. I had enough yarn to weave a pair of blankets and to knit stockings for the whole family, a lovely big shawl for me, and still had some left over. We dyed our yarn different colors. Blue indigo was used a lot. It was very beautiful, and everyone liked that color. I used red for sweaters and jackets for the children. To make the dye color fast, we dipped it into chamber dye every morning for several mornings, till we got the exact shade that we wanted. It wore like iron, and was very nice looking when made up into jeans and other clothings, skirts for the girls. I bought 5 pounds of cotton thread, which I used as warp on the loom to weave onto the woolen yarn. I wove on Grandma Brown's loom at first. Then T.W. made me a far better one than could be found anywhere around. But why did he break up your lovely looms? I asked. Because I nearly killed myself just before Gracie was born. I had an order for 15 yards of carpet, and I wanted to finish it and get the money to pay for my confinement. I threaded up my loom and began weaving just as fast as I could, when all at once I felt the first pains and knew that before 24 hours were up, I would be confined. Then the carpet would never get done for weeks. So I wove for 15 hours, but toward the last I had to stop, frequently between the pains. But I finished the carpet, took it off the loom, and measured it before I gave up and went to bed. I was ill for 1 year after the baby was born, got gathered breasts, and even lost my nice complexion. T.W. was so angry at my foolhardiness that he took an axe and broke up both my lovely looms and forbade me to ever weave again. I made good money weaving and loved doing it. If I got up early, I wove 1 hour before breakfast, only when TW was gone. Emmy had to do all the housework after Annie was married, so I could work at earning what I could. If I wove right after breakfast till 2 p.m., I could get 9 yards done. That meant I'd earned $1. But if I made pretty stripes and designs, it took longer, so I'd weave 8 yards for $1. I hired a girl only once in my life. I paid her 50 cents a day for doing nothing. She didn't even know how to set a table. It was when Sam was born. I kept her 4 days and fired her. Got along alone after that. When Emmy was born, it was just 20 months after Sam. It was in that same little log cabin where we first lived when we came to Centerville. I couldn't get Sister Duncan nor Grandma Brown. They were busy elsewhere. I had to get the only available nurse. She was a graduate and charged too much and didn't stay. Just came and went each day for 4 days, and then I fired her and got along best I could. Only once did I ever have to punish Annie, and that was for only half-washing clothes and hanging them out, still soiled. I took her out to the line and showed her the streaks in the clothes, and then took a switch and gave her a right good switching. She didn't resent it. She knew she deserved it, and she always took her work beautifully after that. It happened when TW first brought her to live with us. She and I got along very well, and I taught her to knit, sew, and do handwork, which she loved doing. Grandma Brown was indeed a good Samaritan. Everybody loved her. She'd forgive anybody anything and was always willing to help wherever needed. When Emmy was born, TW was the proudest man I ever saw. He set right to work and made her a special crib. A cradle actually wasn't good enough for her. She was his first daughter and his favorite child. He painted the crib pink and edged it in black. It truly was a lovely piece of furniture. Johnny was born just 2 years and 2 months after Emmy. He is very like his father in actions, quick and efficient. Brother T. Whitaker will never die so long as Johnny lives. He looks so like his father, except TW was a much larger man and somehow much handsomer. He was a deeply religious man, and in that way they were truly alike. John was the homeliest of all my children, but far more even-tempered and very slow to anger, a trait which the others often lacked. He was always a good boy, and the older boys loved to tease him, and did so all the time. He took it all in such good part. Will and Sam were full of mischief, and seemed to enjoy tormenting him, but he grew up to learn the carpenter trade with his father. He worked his way through school, learned Pitman shorthand, and worked at the church historian office, where he met and fell in love with Ida Taylor. She was 4 years his senior. They were married and had a lovely wedding in the Gardo House, formerly called the Amelia Palace, built by Brigham Young and occupied by him and later by John Taylor, Ida's father, and third president of the church. The building belonged and was built for the church. Susan, my 5th child, was a tiny black-haired, blue-eyed baby, pretty as could be, and grew up to be even prettier. She was always very sensitive and shy, but proud. Millie's girl, same age, was her closest chum, even from childhood. Susie had many male admirers, chief among them your father's brother, Horace David Barber. They almost got married, and then along came Ben Rollins, and he won out. Grandma Brown was my midwife and nurse when Mamie was born. She was a most beautiful baby and grew up to be my most beautiful daughter. They all had lovely, thick, long hair, but hers was thickest and longest, and a lovely, deep dark brown, not jet black like Susie's. Her eyes were large and a brown shade too. She had diphtheria when Alma and Gracie did, and we almost lost her too. She was a young woman when she had it, and was married shortly after she recovered. Had it not been for her iron constitution, Dr. Seymour B. Young said she could never have made it. She had many sweethearts, among them a young widower, very handsome with 2 children, but she turned him down. She worked in the Salt Lake Church library and lived with John, who had been married a short time. Brig Taylor, Ida's brother, who was the alcoholic, fell in love with her and almost got away with it before he became a drunkard, but I put a stop to that. seeing where it would lead, for he drank some even then, and became worse and worse. Eliza Porter and I had our babies very nearly the same time. I remember when her Jessie was born. I was told that he weighed 16 pounds, but I wouldn't believe it. I went to see her, and when I looked at that baby there by her side in bed, his face and head looked as big as hers. And if they'd told me he weighed 20 pounds, I would have believed it. He never stopped growing. He grew to be a very big man and married. When the girl was first introduced to him, she exclaimed, "That's the man I want to marry." And she did. The Porters always held their heads high, sort of looked down on us lesser folk. I used to sit up in bed when I had my babies and braid straw hats. We used oat straw soaked in water, and I braided in 7 strands at once. I made my boys and TW lovely straw hats and sewed them by hand, starting in the crown, and filled it in toward the brim. To fasten one straw to the next, we would push the smaller end into the one ahead of it, and they would hold like iron when the wet straw dried, and without cracking like a gooseneck curtain rod. We were very particular to select the longest, most even straws of all the same size for these hats. I made Sam, Will, John, and TW each a hat in this way, and they liked them very much for farming and shingling houses or any kind of work out in the hot sun. They were so durable yet cool and comfortable to wear. I also made satin and velvet hats, and John Adams sold them in his store. When Joe, my 7th child, was born, I was nearly crazy. TW just having married in polygamy. I felt terrible. I couldn't eat or sleep, just cried and carried on most terribly. TW got after me and said, "When you act like this, you are acting like an old setting hen." That really hurt my feelings, and I told Grandma Brown. So after Joe was born, she washed and dressed him and then carried him out to the kitchen where TW was, holding him up, and said, "Pretty good for an old setting hen, ain't he?" He couldn't say a word. The baby was such a lovely big youngster. He weighed 10 pounds. It was just before Josephine's birth that Annie, then being courted by Alberta Slater, a much older man, and having another wife and family, asked her to marry him. Much against my advice, she accepted, and they were married, and she left at once to live in North Ogden, and I was left without the help I so needed. It was then I heard that terrible explosion when the arsenal was blown up by 3 boys who were out shooting. They shot at the building closest to them. It blew up, and the explosion set off the other 2. It shook the earth clear out to where we lived. I took out the window and could see the heavy, thick smoke billowing up into the sky, and said, "Well, I always thought those hot springs would blow up sooner or later. And there they go, a real volcano." The night Evie was born, TW went up to the other house. I told him not to go, that I would be sick before morning. But he went anyway, saying, "If you take sick, you can send for me." "I will not," I answered. I got sick and sent Johnny for Grandma Brown. The boys, Will and Sam, wanted to go for Father, but I forbade them to go. When Grandma Brown got there and saw how sick I was, she wanted to send for Father, but I would not allow it. Evie was born in the night. Next morning he returned after breakfast. I told her why I wouldn't send for him, and she said, "I don't blame you." He came into the bedroom where I was, and there was the baby. He looked so surprised and hurt. I never will forget his expression. He demanded to know why he hadn't been sent for, but I didn't say one word. I've told you of Gracie's birth and how he broke up my looms. I had Grandma Brown when Almy was born. It was in late October. He had large gray eyes and beautiful dark hair. From the time he was a baby, he had the sweetest disposition of any of the other children. A lot like John's, but they looked nothing alike. Every child I had was so different. Many who knew and saw them remarked on this. Their dispositions were very different, too. No 2 of them were at all alike. Grandma Brown liked to name the babies, mine especially, that she delivered, so I let her. But when Gracie was quite little, she didn't like her name. She said, "It's Gracie," she said. "It's Gracie this and Gracie that. Why did you have to name me Gracie?" By the time my youngest child, Walter, was born, Grandma Brown was dead. I had Sister Randall, the bishop's mother, attend me. T.W. was away in Ogden. But when he returned, he picked up the 10-pound baby boy and turned to Mrs. Randall, saying, "Now, that doesn't look like the last one, does it?" If he'd been close enough to me as I lay in bed, I'd have hit him. It made me so angry. I thought, "Oh, you men, I hate you. You never could be satisfied." I had 2 miscarriages after that. Susie said if Father were still alive, Mother would be having babies yet. But I hardly think I would. Sam was barely 20 years old when he married. He fell in love with a Farr girl, but her father had 2 daughters, and he wanted Sam to marry both of them. But Sam said, "I want to see if I can live with one wife first, before I take another." Lots of men married sisters at that time. He married Elizabeth Jane Thomas. She was older than Sam. Soon afterward, Janie was in a store, and a man came up to her and said, "I hear Sam Whitaker has taken a boy to raise." It made her so mad, she retorted, "That's a fault of Whitaker boys, or didn't you know?" Janie's father was Welsh, and her mother French. Janie had a twin sister, Mary Ann. She married a Peterson the same day. They were identical twins. Janie had 4 boys and 3 girls. Sam was called on a mission after the birth of the 4th baby. After he returned, she had the 3 girls. I have told you how she died in childbirth. After her death, he married Janie's younger sister, Margaret Thomas. She bore him 1 child, a son, Warren. As my children grew up, I wanted to go on the range, up in Weber County, and take up land, and help them to get good farms for themselves, to give them a good start in life. But T.W. would not go. Neither would Sam or Will. Both preferred the carpenter trade to a life drudging on a farm. Millie went, and I missed her as my nearest neighbor. Then T.W. sold a fine piece of land where Cheneys now live, which was farther north from our home. It was so he could buy a smaller piece of land to the east of us, where he wanted to build for him and Hannah a house. I begged him to let me go up and live on the land north, and not sell it, and let Hannah have my house, but he would not. He said it meant too much walking for him. He had to have my signature as his first wife in order to sell it. If I had to do it over again, I would not sign. Trouble doesn't kill, or there'd be few of us left alive. I never dreamed any of my children would die, no matter how sick they got. I thought I'd had enough trouble, and I couldn't lose my children, but I was not the judge. One day, when Walty was about 4 years old, T.W. went to Salt Lake to buy lumber to build a steamboat under contract. It never got built. The last thing he ever did was to trim some rose bushes the night before, then went up to Hannah's to spend the night. Next morning, he came down to my house for breakfast. He looked awful. He said, "I can't eat a thing. I'm sick." I made him a cup of green tea and made him drink it. And then he went off to Salt Lake, sick as he was, wouldn't see a doctor. I never saw him alive again. He tried to buy the stuff for the boat, and did, but he got worse. He fell down on the sidewalk, and they took him into the saloon right there. They made him drink a glass of wine. He then took with such cramps that they carried him upstairs. He suffered terribly. Only John and Bishop Cheney were with him. Once, during his agony, he looked up at John and said, "Oh, John, I wish your mother were here. She is such a good nurse. She'd know what to do to help me." But he died before I could get there. I knew when I saw Bishop Cheney that he must be dead, or dying. The OSL train was running through Centerville then, so I went to Salt Lake on that. It was the quickest way. I went to Emmy's house, and the first one I saw was John. He was leaning up against the outside wall, crying. I went up to him and said, "John, is your father dead?" And he nodded. Emmy's first baby, Romania, was just 6 weeks old. She took it so hard. At her father's funeral, she looked as white as snow. All my people have died suddenly. My father, Will, my husband, and his son, Will, later on, and of course, T.W. When the news of his death reached Centerville, little Gracie was up in a peach tree getting blossoms. The limb broke and she fell, injuring herself internally, some way so that she could never eat solid food anymore. just soft foods. When Almy heard of his father's death, it frightened him so terribly that he ran and hid in the haystack and stayed there for hours, crying and sobbing, and would not come out. After the funeral, he began being sick, and his nerves were shot to pieces. He began to have St. Vida's dance, shaking day and night. He never got completely well again, and the diphtheria killed him. We had to burn all the clothes and bedding of those who died with that dreaded disease. All three, Mamie, Almy, and Gracie, had it. Dr. Seymour B. Young gave me hopes that Mamie, being the oldest and in better physical condition than the others, might recover. 2 weeks after Almy's death, I entered the room where Mamie lay, and she said to me, "Mama, Gracie is going to die." I asked, "How do you know that?" "Because I just had a dream, and Almy came for her, dressed in a lovely white suit and rowing a little boat." He stood up and held out his arms to her, and she went with him. Don't think I ever told you about Mrs. Wayman. She was much younger than me. She went to keep house for him right after his first wife died, and then he married her. His first wife had no children. She bore him 4 boys. She and I were both from the Isle of Man. We called ourselves Manxmen. We were very good friends. From the day we first met, we loved each other. They had 4 sons. 3 of them grew to manhood, died rather young. Only the youngest one, Eddie, lived to be an old man. She raised those teenage boys all alone. They were good young men, but the boy, Eddie, was rather spoiled by his mother, and when he was in his late teens, he ran away. He got some money by taking what he collected for a load of hay his mother had sent him to deliver and collect on. He was only about 15 or 16. He was gone 3 weeks when he ran out of money. With his last 10 cents, he sent his mother a special delivery letter asking her to send him enough money to come home. She was a widow and alone, the others grown and gone, but she sent him a prompt reply to get home the best way he could. He'd get no money from her. He did, and never ran away again. Your Aunt Susie always spoke her mind. Once, when she was a girl, she went to work for Bellsmith, the haughty, sharp-tongued gossip I've told you of. A polygamous wife. She said to Susie, "I suppose when you leave here, you'll go about telling all sorts of mean things about me. You won't be disappointed when you hear them then, will you?" she retorted. One time, Tom Brandon and his gang stole $20 gold pieces from O.M. Duell. Jim Baird found it out and reported it. Then Tom was jailed. He swore vengeance on Baird, who lived in polygamy at the time. The poor man was afraid for his life, his family and property, and finally took his family and moved out of town and away. B.H. Roberts was jailed for polygamy. His jailers commanded him to serve them at a banquet. He was fighting mad, saying, "I'll see you in H.E. double hockey sticks first." He swore he'd get even with them or the government for jailing him. And he did. When he was past 60, he got into the army as chaplain and went with the 145th Division in the First World War overseas to France. He was their chaplain, and he loved it, and so did they. He was far past the age limit, but got in anyway. How? I don't exactly know. Orson Hyde was a staunch Jew, but had been converted to Mormonism. He was a tall, stout man with sandy hair and complexion. He had a family of girls, and I went to school with some of them. He was the president of the mission while we were there. He later came back to Utah. He was a very smart man. Brigham Young once said that he had to have a glass of whiskey before he could give a good sermon, and that he'd stumble over $10 to pick up 5 cents. My father baptized me in the Missouri River. It was the 7th of March, my birthday, and they had to break the ice. It was actually a large stream, a branch of the river. Several other children were baptized the same day. Council Bluffs, where we stayed after being driven from Nauvoo, was a small town, only slightly larger than Farmington. My little brother William died there with scarlet fever. Also, the cholera broke out there, and no one dared help anyone else for fear of the disease. Did I tell you I saw a hanging once? Oh, how awful that was. A young boy, not yet 19, with his party, was camping just over the bluff. Some gold miners came in, and they went to a gambling joint, gambled and drank whiskey. One man had $200 or $300 in gold. This boy and his pal were great friends. They both got drunk. He wasn't even a full-grown man. He and his partner, a much older man, had been left to guard the miners' cabin while they were all going out for a good time. But instead, they went gambling. This boy, Jones Manning was his name, lost $300, which he could not pay. They gave him until 7 o'clock the next morning to pay his debt. He and his pal went back to the cabin and to bed. He waited only until the older man was asleep, and then he crept out of bed and went to the corner and got the axe they chopped their wood with, and with one dreadful swing, he chopped off the sleeping man's head. He was drunk when he did it, poor boy, and afterwards he was crazy with fear and remorse when he realized what he'd done. He'd been driven to do it because of his gambling debt. The entire settlement was so angry, they caught him at once and held a hasty trial right out under the trees. Every person in the settlement was there, and I among them. I was almost 13 then, and never, so long as I live, will I ever forget the horror of that dreadful scene. It was between 9 and 10 in the morning, February and very cold. The trees were bare and snow over a foot covered the ground. The sun shone but palely through the clouds. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to be hanged. Then and there. They asked him if he wished to make a speech, but he could not speak. So they gave him a piece of paper and a pencil, and he wrote a farewell note to his mother. Then a mule was brought, and he was made to stand on its back. A man climbed one of the big trees and fastened a rope to a large overhanging limb. The rope had a large noose on the other end of it, which the man lowered to the men on the ground. They tied a black kerchief over his face, which was as white as the snow. His lips had no color at all. He shook so that they had to steady him as he stood there on the mule's back. Just before the mule was struck, the boy cried out, "Don't tell my mother I was hanged." Then the man hit the mule a hard blow with a black whip, and it leaped forward. The boy's body falling tense on the rope was the most terrible thing I ever saw as the noose tightened and jerked his head upward. He flung his arms widely and drew up his feet in the most pitiful, helpless gesture almost to his chin as I fell senseless to the ground. Many others fainted as well. It was the most dreadful thing I ever witnessed. I didn't recover from it for weeks. It haunts me to this day. Council Bluffs is a little narrow place like it was in a canyon. One main street, that was all. I saw the first steamboat that ever came up the Missouri River. Another time a boat came up that river and the fireman was drunk and let the steam get too hot, and it blew up the boat and all the people on it. A number of them, saints who were on their way west, were among those who died. 30 or more people were aboard. Many fell into the water and were drowned. Some were scalded, others blown to bits. Another time I saw a man knock his Negro slave into the water from the ship that they were on, and I saw him drown. We were on a ship going in the opposite direction. I could see his head going up and down, and not a soul moved to help him. I've always wanted a blue hat, so I got me one this last time I was in California. The clerk put it on me, and Evie said, "Mother, you need blue earrings to go with it." And do you know, the cute clerk took the ones right off her ears and put them on me. They matched perfectly, and she gave them to me. "Let's see how you look in them." "Why, I look like an old fool, of course, but I like them a lot, just the same." "Mother, that's a girl's hat," Evie exclaimed. "Well, I'm a girl, aren't I? An old girl, to be sure, but a girl just the same. When my family was growing up, I never went to bed, but that I had to mend something, pants, socks, or sew on a button. I knit 2 pairs of stockings for everyone in the family, and they lasted a year if I kept them mended. Sometimes the holes got so big, I'd pick up the stitches on my knitting needles and knit the patch right into the sock. Christy gave her a new $1 greenback. She tried at first not to take it then. Bless my soul, I got $6 on Mother's Day. Now this makes 7. Well, I guess they figured I needed it. I haven't earned anything for such a long time. I know what I'll do with it, but I won't tell Christy. She'll think I'm being extravagant. Tell me, Grandma, for that's what I want you to do." "Well, I'll buy $1's worth of beer, and I'll let Emmy and Rigel boss it, and I'll go over every now and then and help them drink it. It's always important to know and remember that things could be worse. You can spend a lot of time gossiping and do nothing. So when I went for my milk, I always took along some handwork and worked while I waited or visited. That's how I got a lot of my fancy work done. If you get just one stitch in, it counts just that much. I think that the reason people get such bad shapes is that they don't walk enough. I walk a little every day, if it's only enough to get my hinges greased. Where did you get that beautiful purse, Grandma? I asked. Why, this purse is over 35 years old. It's real alligator hide. It was on my birthday. I was up to Evie's when she lived in Ogden. I got 6 purses that day from my children, so I took 5 of them back and got money for them and kept this one. Joe gave it to me. He was richer than he is now, and he put 2 $5 gold pieces in it. It's a young trunk. Many times I've put my toothbrush and nightie in it and gone away to spend the night. Once at a big family get-together, Joe began a heated criticism of his father. If he'd only had sense enough to keep what land he had and take up more, he could have left us all a fine portion that would have been a good start for each of us. But no, he must sell a piece here and another there, and put her along with carpenter work instead of getting rich. This more to tease his mother because she so seldom stuck up for T.W., but one thing she would not permit, that her children should criticize him. All began to agree with Joe that Father really had been a bit unwise. Then Grandma spoke up calmly. Well, you're all big grown men now, and I don't see any millionaires among my sons. Once, while staying with her daughter, Emmy and Rigel, she was given a rather low chair at the table. Low because the rockers had been removed. Even the cushion added did not quite bring her up high enough. Dear me, I hate low chairs. Well, Grandma, you'll have to put a sheet of paper on it, offered Rigel. And then I might be too high, she retorted. Grandma, if you had your life to live over again, would you change it? If I had the knowledge I have now, and had even an inkling of what lay ahead, there are things I would most certainly change. But if I had to do it over again, and had no knowledge of how things would go, no, I would not go back, even one day, for fear I may not do even so well the second time around. You surely have held your age well. Everyone that comes to see you remarks on how you look so young for your age. Most of them just say that to make me feel good, but I'd rather wear out than rust out, as I've so often told you. If you want to live a long time and keep young, work. Never let yourself be idle. That goes for mind as well as body. Think and reason things out. Solve your own problems if possible. If you can't, then seek advice from someone wise who you can really trust. If the advice is good, take it, even if you find it hard to. Most folks ask, hoping they'll get a reply that suits them, whether it be good or bad. It takes a smart person to know when he's wrong and accept correction. I'm no different, but I always try to do what's best for all concerned. That was my father's policy. Then her mind wandered back to her later widowhood. Bill W. was a mean old devil. I could never think of him as a human being. He married some relative of your father, cousin, I think. He killed her with his inhumane brutality. He looked just like a beast when he walked, all stooped over in his great long arm, and his great long arms hung down, and his big paw-like hands, covered with hair, almost touched the ground. His tombstone teeth protruded from his jaws, like the tusks of a wild boar. Oh, how Susan hated him. Once she was there helping nurse his poor wife, who had just been confined with twins. He said to her, "Dang it, girl, you're too darn pretty. I'd like to kiss you twice on the same spot. I'd do it too if I were 24 years younger, and you'd have a hard time getting away." It made her so mad that she was actually sick to her stomach. She went outside and vomited. She was a real beauty, black Irish. Some folks described her jet black hair and large dark blue eyes, pale pink rose petal skin, not a blemish. Her daughter Josephine looks a lot like her. She married Ben Rollins. I like Ben. He was always good to me. Their first baby was a boy. They named him Oscar. He married a very sweet girl, Pearl Bybee, and they had 12 children. The only one of my children or grandchildren who had as many children as I did. Susie had 4 more children, all girls. Josephine, your favorite cousin, was the last. Oh yes, she and I are very close, almost like sisters. I love her very much. When she was born, they knew little or nothing about germs and how important it was to be sanitary. The doctor that attended her came directly to her from a woman he had just delivered who had childbed fever. He attended to my Susie without even washing his hands. He transmitted that dreadful disease to her, and she almost died from it. She was critically ill for weeks, and when she finally did recover, it left her in a semi-paralyzed condition for the rest of her life. She lived for 15 years, a partial invalid, moving very slowly, unable ever again to move normally. It was a blessing the 3 older children were married. That left Thelma and Josephine at home. Yes, I remember. They lived up in Mountain Green. I'd visited Josephine there several times. I'm sure Ben was good to her and cared for her very much, but they had entirely different natures. She was so dainty, so modest, gentle and refined. He was all man, rough, ready, very masculine, rather aggressive, demanding, strict obedience, not too patient. All in all, her life was not a bed of roses, but she made the best of it. So did he. She never complained, was a good wife and mother. She died the 17th of June, 1914, there at her home, and is buried up there in Mountain Green. I sort of put off telling you of my Will's death. I had 6 boys and 6 girls. Will, my eldest child, by Oakton. So many of my people met with violent death. So it was with Will. It was the summer of 1910. Sam, Will, and Joe got together and planned that I go to the fair in St. Louis. It was while I was on my trip home that Will's death occurred. He and his wife had separated and he was living with me. He had taken to drinking more and more after his divorce, but he managed to be sober when at home with me. He always liked duck hunting. On this particular day, he decided to clean his shotgun, ready for the early morning hunt. He went out on the back lawn where the light was better than indoors. He found a shell that had been lodged in the barrel. He thought it was exploded, but it wasn't. He got his ramrod and tried to push it out that way, but it wouldn't budge, so he propped it up on the clothesline. Somehow or other, the line caught onto the trigger, and the gun went off and shot him in the chest. It was about 3:30 in the afternoon, and school was out. The children were going home. He dragged himself out to the front lawn where one of them saw him, and they ran over to your father's shop, which was only a half block from there, on the west side of the street, and told your mother, who was helping in the store with your father. They closed the store and rushed to him. They got a mattress from the house and rushed him to Farmington, to the nearest doctor. But he was bleeding so badly that he died on the way. But not before he told your mother how it happened. The blood-soaked mattress had to be discarded. They held his body an extra day till I got there, so I could attend the funeral. Poor Will, I loved him so. But he had 3 beautiful daughters, and they had a very close relationship with him until their mother moved to Salt Lake and took them with her. And then he saw them but seldom. They all grew up and married. Lorena, the eldest, had children. So did Alta, the youngest. But Lucille, the middle girl, had a dreadful case of typhoid fever when she was younger, which left her so when she married. She was unable to have children. I nursed her with the disease, and we all but lost her. She was frightfully ill for weeks. Your mother, Emmy, and your father were with Will when he died, and he told her how the accident happened. I once heard a man say, "It's hard to tell the truth sometimes, like climbing up a steep hill, but oh, so easy to lie. They seem to be greased and just slip out. And the more you tell, the easier they slip." Evie, my 8th child, married George Halverson. A finer man never lived. He treated her like a queen. She was such a beauty that she turned the heads of all the men. She was very like my brother. Blonde, copper-colored hair. Exquisite skin and features. And she knew her own charm. She would not be told what to do by anyone. They had 2 fine, brilliant boys, Byron and Spencer. Both became lawyers like their father. They moved to California in 1914. George built up a fine business and was retained by the higher-ups and became financially independent. They were very generous to me and had me visit them for a month at a time, every winter, while I was able to travel. I loved going there, too. She'd take me shopping and buy me lovely clothes and things. Once, when we went to buy a hat, the clerk kept bringing out things I didn't like. Finally, I said, "Haven't you got anything else? All these are for old women. I was only in my 80s then and didn't feel old. They both burst out laughing, though I saw nothing to laugh at. George, her husband, always called me mother. He lost his own mother early in life. I loved him like a son, and he treated me like a true son would treat the mother he loved. You see, I lost 2 husbands, my father, 5 children, and my mother, yet here I still am. Why? I don't know. But we can't pick and choose in this life. At least that's what I've always tried to do. You haven't talked much about Aunt Josephine, I reminded her. Oh, yes. She was my 7th child by T.W. Very artistic, witty, as were they all, and a bit sarcastic at times. She loved art, painted some. She met and fell in love with Hugh B. Folsom, and it was for keeps. They were about as perfect a couple as could ever be. Seemed to be made for each other. He was a school principal, and they lived in Salt Lake. Her girlhood chum was Addie Williams. I forgot her maiden name, but she married Joe Williams. Josephine had 8 children. I nursed her with each one. They all lived, grew up, and got married. She had 2 girls, Etheline, then Florence first. Paul was her first boy. Then came Edna and Donald, and 3 more girls, Juliet, Rhea, and Dorothy. They were all well-behaved children. They come to see me when they can. What are you going to wear to your big birthday party your family is planning for you? I asked one day in late February of 1937. When are they going to have it? Aunt Mame wants it at her house, and they've all agreed. But when? 7th of March, just about 2 weeks away. Just think, you'll be 98. How about that blue dress, the lace one that Aunt Eva bought for you? It's so nice on you, and newer than the others. Yes, I like that dress, and I was afraid I wasn't going to get to wear it anymore. Glad you thought of it. And so the big day finally arrived. They came for Grandma about 10:30, the morning of March 7th, 1937, which marked her 98th birthday. I had her all ready, bathed and dressed in her blue lace dress, hair snowy white around her face, curled slightly, and oh, so thrilled at the thought of the party. After she had gone, I cooked lunch and got myself ready. After feeding the family, my 2 girls asked if they might go. I told them yes. So they too dolled up in their new starched gingham dresses for the occasion. That was some party! All Grandma's living children were there, in their order. My mother Emily, Uncle John and his wife Ida, Uncle Ben, Susan's husband, Uncle Joe and wife Florence, Aunt Josephine and Hugh Folsom, Aunt Eva and husband George Halverson, all the way from California, Uncle Walt and Aunt Blanche, his wife, and of course Mamie and her husband Charles Parrish. I shall not attempt to name the grandchildren and great-grandchildren and the great-great-grandchildren, but all who possibly could attend were there, not to mention the host of friends and neighbors. There was a constant stream of people for 2 or 3 hours, some attending from other states. Many had to be introduced to one another, relatives who had not seen each other for years or not at all, news photographers taking pictures and getting interviews, young and old mingling, getting acquainted and reacquainted. It was remarked that it should have been held in a church to accommodate such a crowd of people. Christy, my sister from Cedar, was there with her 4 beautifully groomed children, Dorothy, Bob, Marion, and Gail. Aunt Josephine recognized them and stepped forward to greet Christy warmly. "These are Christy and her children," she explained, "all the way from Cedar City to be here." Behind them marched my 2 girls, Josie and Emily, in their gingham frocks. "And who might these be?" someone asked. "Oh," answered one of the aunts, "they're some of Nora's, I think." I had gone early and was in the kitchen helping with the refreshments. When we got home that night, the 2 girls reenacted this choice scene for their father and the brothers, Jarvis, Richard, and Rigel. They were good at taking off or mimicking scenes that they thought funny, undaunted by their inexpensive dresses or what not. We all had a good laugh. Grandma was utterly worn out after the party. It was too much for her, even though she enjoyed every minute of it. She never did recover fully. She tired more easily, had longer rest periods, and her appetite failed some. The old cough from the bronchitis returned, and then one day in late May, Aunt Mame came to see her and announced that she would return the following day and take her to her home and take care of her. I knew she realized the end was near, and she was right. But I wanted to care for her until the very end, but was not allowed to do so. I went to see her a few days later, and she was flat down in bed. I knew she should be propped up as the doctor had warned me. and said so, but they all disagreed with me, saying she was too weak now and should be allowed to rest peacefully. The end came the 7th of June, 1937. She died very peacefully. We all thought she was asleep, but she opened her eyes and her face lit up with a sudden radiance. She seemed to look straight past us and up toward the ceiling, as though she were greeting someone. I leaned a little closer to catch her last words. "Oh, I knew it would be you," as she partly raised herself in greeting, still with that beautiful smile, the wrinkles seeming to smooth themselves out, and there was a peculiar type of joy in her expression that I cannot describe. It enveloped her whole being, and then she fell back, lifeless on her pillow. She is buried in the Centerville Cemetery beside T.W. and her children. Her funeral was held in the Centerville First Ward Chapel the 13th of June, 1937. I talked to the mortician, Merrill Holbrook, who prepared her for burial at the Union Mortuary in Bountiful, and he said, "I have never seen so young-looking a body in one so old in all my years here. She could easily pass for 70 or perhaps 75 at the most." I went early to the mortuary to bid her goodbye, alone for the last time before the grand reunion in heaven. They had done a beautiful job. She looked to me like a stately queen ready to meet her Maker, in her lovely white temple robes softly pleated across her breast, yet still with that hint of pride which was so much a part of her, but without the shadow of dominance, unashamed and at peace. Dear, dear Grandma, how I loved her. There will never be another more brave, more hard-working, more honest and faithful than she. True to the very end, I now look forward to joining her one of these days, if I myself can but prove worthy enough. Signed, Nora B. Miles. And there's her signature. Well, thanks so much for joining me on this journey of rereading the biography of Elizabeth Mills Oakton Whitaker, my great-great-great-grandma. It almost took a year, but we made it. Again, stay tuned for the documentary, and stay tuned for the next book reading.